Welcome back to Lifting Jebel Part 2. If you guys missed the first part, as a quick recap, I essentially told you what lift I got, why I got the lift I got, and blase blase. So if you do want to go back to that, I'll put a link in the description below. But moving on with this video, I will be teaching you guys not only how to put on a 2-inch lift, but how to also do it in your driveway. There are going to be a few tools that you'll need, which we'll talk as we go through, but you can see that I've already kind of gotten the tires off and up on jack stands, but I will quickly talk about that. But without any further ado, let's start putting on this lift. So guys, the first thing you're going to want to do is to make sure you have your vehicle in park or neutral if it's a manual, and have your parking brake or emergency brake engaged. Next, what you're going to want to have is the wheels chalked. Now I have my wheels chalked on the rear of the vehicle because my driveway is a little bit of a hill, and it's going to roll in that direction. So make sure you guys chalk it appropriately. Don't just follow what I did. Next, once you get it lifted by lifting up on a secure lift point, for me, it's going to be my front differential. You're going to put the jack stands as high as they can go on the frame, not on any suspension, not on an axle, none of that, on the frame. The reason for that is you want to be able to move this axle up and down. So if it's on the jack stands, you can't move it up and down. Then make sure you guys do not have it all the way relaxed. You want to have it up a little bit. The reason for that is because if you don't have anything underneath the axle and lift it up a little bit, as soon as you start taking this stuff off, it's going to fall. And it might only fall a few inches, or it might fall all the way down depending on how your vehicle's set up. You just have to make sure that everything is immobilized, because you don't want to get your fingers caught or get something slammed into your hand or anything like that. You don't want to create any pinch points, and be wary of what you're doing, because this vehicle, though it's somewhat secure, there could be an accident. So make sure you guys aren't underneath anything. Make sure you're trying to stay out of the way in case it falls or anything like that. So if you have a Land Rover, these are some meaty lug nuts. These lug nuts are a 27 millimeter. So once you get it up on jack stands, once you get it kind of in position, now you might have to raise the axle up so that you can get the tire out, but get the tires off. Then after that, you're going to come up here, and there's a few things you're going to have to move. One is the coolant reservoir, because the top of the shock tower, which I don't know if you guys can see, is right there, you're not going to be able to get to the bolt. So the way to remove this is to pick it straight up, and you can see right here, these were sitting in that. So you pick it straight up, then you have another section right here, and it's hooked in, and you're essentially going to slide back and up. You have a hose right here and all this wiring. So once you get it up out of that little clip, you're going to want to kind of push it towards the engine and then get it around and pick it up. And just kind of place it to where there's no tension or anything, but it also is out of your way. You don't want to bust any hoses or anything like that. So now that side is free. Now over here on this side, you can try to leave it like it is and just kind of work around it, or some people remove this section of the air intake. Shooter's preference, I'm going to try to work around it, because the less I move, the happier I am. So that being said, now let's go to our next part, which is removing the shocks and the springs. So guys, before we install the lift kit, there's a few things I want you to know when you're installing the new lift kit, make sure you're putting the right parts in the right place. 1, my rear is taller than my front spring. Make sure you guys compare the old with the new so you know which one goes where. Also, you see on these, it says DS. The other spring will say NS because one is driver's side, one is near side or passenger side. You need to make sure you put the spring in the right place. Not only placement is it proper, you also have to make its orientation proper. And what I mean by that is if you look at the rear spring and how the spacing is really narrow compared to the bottom of the spring, that's the top. If you can't figure it out because it looks a little bit harder on this, to just get a tape measure and just measure the distance between the two. Also, make sure that your spring matches the shock. And what I mean by that is not making sure it's Ironman and Ironman, but make sure that the shock can withstand a 2-inch lift, and means by height. These two shocks are the same height right now, but this one is the old one. It's fully extended. This one is compressed. That old shock will not work on this new lift kit. Not only because it's bad, you can see how bad this is by pushing it really easily, and until I flip it upside down, it barely pulls out. It should naturally do it by comparison. See how it's rising on its own? It should do that. Shouldn't be fast, depending on your shock, but it should expand itself. Make sure you pay attention to the torque specs that come with the lift kit's owner's manual or installation manual. Also, make sure that your shock is primed by pumping it a few times. Not all shocks require this, some of them do. Don't do it live by installing the shock on the vehicle and then just taking a few bumps. You need to do it yourself. You gotta get that air out. You can have shock fade or shock failure. A lot of things can happen. But these things you need to know before you install it on the vehicle. So let's go back to Jebel and let's actually get the front on. We're back out here in the Land Rover, and ignore the fact that the spring is here because I will show you guys how to do the other side completely. I just had to install this real quick so that any tips or tricks that I can come up with or work out, I wasn't doing it live, so you had a better video. But anyway, one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about was, you could see I uninstalled this bracket. Don't uninstall this. Leave it up in there. What you need to do is you need to disconnect the front drive shaft to the front differential, which will let this axle sag all the way down. The reason why you need to do that is because even if you compress this spring all the way to the same size as the old one, it will not fit. So you have to have the axle all the way down, and then you can barely get this spring in when you compress it a little bit further than this old spring. Another thing is to make sure, you can see on this old rubber grommet, I put a nut in the mount so that when I was installing the spring, I wasn't having to keep my fingers up in there and like press that up while installing this. Because this spring is compressed, it's essentially a grenade waiting to explode. So you don't want to be messing with a whole bunch of stuff and getting your finger stuck, and then all of a sudden that spring, not that it's supposed to, but in case it does expand, you don't want your hand up in there. You just want to be able to kind of keep yourself away and safe from it in case something bad happens. Also, make sure that your jack can go all the way down. Don't put the like off-road jack or anything like that, because you want this axle to sag as much as possible. There will be a few things that will limit this from sagging all the way down to the ground, but that's okay. You don't need it to touch the ground, but you need it really low. So now I'm going to go to the other side and I'm going to show you how I got this spring I installed, but on the other side. So when installing the spring, okay, there's a few things you need to know. One, the spring has essentially the end of the spring where the coil ends needs to end up right here. So make sure with whatever you're using to compress the spring, you're able to rotate it to where that spring will sit there. Also, forgot to say this earlier, kind of uninstall the brake line. You don't have to completely remove the caliper, but just so you have a little bit of room, and make sure that when you sag your axle that your brake line isn't becoming taut and putting stress on the brake line. So like I said earlier, we got this essentially installed. Now this is kind of sitting on its own. You can see there's a gap, but once, if it happens to fall, it won't fall all the way down. And you don't need to do all of them, because once you get that spring in and you go to do the shock again, you're gonna have to uninstall this anyway so that you can get the shock tower on. But that's in the future. Let's worry about getting the spring in. So make sure you guys, like I said, compress the spring. I'm not gonna suggest how you compress the spring. Some people say this is a good idea. Some people say this is a good idea. Do whatever you think is best and safest and get it in there. So I'm gonna go ahead and put the spring in. So we got the spring in. Now there are a few things I need you to look out for before you install the shock. One is the fact that this axle is relaxed. When it relaxes, it goes down and curls back because of these arms. So once you're ready to install the shocks, you need to raise the axle back up, because you can see there's this little gap here and it won't be filled until the axle makes this plate flush. So when raising this axle, make sure that this thing is in properly, because if it gets compressed and then it slips out, it's going to become an RPG. So you don't want that. So be careful when raising your axle and making sure that not only is that little end of the coil towards the axle where that divot was I showed you earlier, but also make sure that it's seating up here properly too. So we're going to raise the axle and then we'll move on to reinstalling the shocks and all these different components. I do want to say I am going to be installing the drive shaft back, or I shouldn't say installing, but connecting the drive shaft back together to the front. But I'm not going to show you, it will just be done. So we're only focusing on what I had to do to get the shock and stuff in. We have slid the shock in, and I'm not going to go into all that detail. You guys know how you uninstalled it. You can reinstall it the same way. There's just a few pointers I want to talk about before I start tightening things. One is the bolt that secures the top portion of the shock. The nut is facing towards the engine on both sides. You're going to slide it in here. I know it would make more sense to rotate it, but for whatever reason, mine doesn't line up with the 4 bolts that secure the shock tower. So I just wanted to point that out. Also, we're going to secure those 4 bolts at the bottom of the shock tower with the nuts. Then I'm going to secure the top portion of the shock. The reason why I'm doing that is because when we manipulate this axle, it will be easier to move this into its position than it is to do the top portion. You can do it, it's more hassle. So just make sure you do the top first, then the bottom. So I'm gonna go ahead and secure these 4 bolts with their nuts, and then secure the top portion of the shock, and then I'll show you guys how I get this mounted. And remember, I'm only showing you guys one side. I've already done the other side. You're just gonna manipulate whatever you do this side to the other side. It's the exact same, except for the top part, there's gonna be, you know, a coolant reservoir compared to the air intake tubing. So you would have to move both either way, but just as a heads up, I'm not going to do the whole video like this. Got all this up top secured. Now we're down here. I got one bolt in on this side, and I went down a little bit just so that it would hold decently. Now this side, I can't, it's not lined up no matter what I do, and it's because the actual threads are not lined up with this plate that sits on top of the threads. The real best way to do it, I shouldn't say the best way, but the way that I was able or am able to accomplish this is by grabbing some type of hammer and essentially tapping on this base plate and just kind of figuring out where that hole is. So as an example, I'm just going to kind of tap right there and try to see where it feels like there's less resistance. If you tell, if the bolt's sitting like this and it starts going like that, that means you are hitting this side too much and you hit on the back side, and then vice versa. And then of course, if it's leaning that way, you hit it too much on this side. If it's leaning that way, you hit it too much on that side. So I'm not going to go through and have you guys see me tap, 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 tap. Now don't beat the crap out of it, because you want micro movement. You just want, I mean, you could be 1/100th of a centimeter off. I mean, you could just barely tap it and it will move because there's so much tension because of the spring. So you don't have to mollywop it. You just kind of tap it in. Just tap it in. Just tap it in. And just do that. Alrighty guys, so we got this lined up. And you'll see I put this one all the way down. Sorry, 2 hands. I put this one all the way down. It is secure. This one, you could see, I don't know if you can actually, but there is a gap. And what I'm going to do is I'm gonna leave that gap like that. And the reason why it's happening is because the axle is rolled forward, and until we put the tires back on and put weight down, it won't put that arm all the way down on the mounting bracket, and then we can tighten that up. But all of that being said, we need to make sure that before we put the tires back on and drop all this, that everything we've touched is tight. You're gonna have to re-tighten everything once you actually put weight down on it all. But, you know, like your drive shaft and I uninstalled this horizontal bracket and stuff like that. I want to make sure everything's tight to a point. Do not torque anything down with a impact. I mean, do not just break bolts. All of this should be hand tightened. Most of this stuff, though it is part of the suspension and the structural integrity of it all, it does not require a lot of torque to make sure it's all secure. So with all that being said, I'm going to go ahead and tighten everything. I'm going to put the tires back on, and then I'm going to show you guys, once everything's back assembled and lowered, how I'm going to go through and tighten everything I've touched. Alright, so we're back underneath. We got the tires on and torqued down and everything's set. Now, I just want to point out a few things. That little bracket that I told you was sitting up pretty high, now it's sitting evenly, and so this bolt is super loose. So we're going to tighten this all the way down. We're going to tighten that other side all the way down and make sure everything's tight. The shock tower mounts, make sure all those bolts are tight. Make sure the top shock is tight. Go back to the back side, make sure the drive shaft is tight, and we're just going to go through all the things that we touched. And now that there is a load on the axle, and make sure it's all tight, because when you have self settle, it could loosen, it could expose more of the bolt, and so we just want to make sure that everything's all cleaned up. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that, and then we'll be moving on to the back side. So you can see we're on the back now, and I've already taken off the tires. I have chalked the front wheels, of course. I lifted the axle and then put my jacks right here. The reason for that is because anywhere forward, there's not a lot of area to be able to have the frame sit properly on the jacks. There's a lot of stuff in the way. There's curves like right here, all that mess. So going towards the back is fine, as long as that axle is relaxed and it doesn't look like it's teetering anywhere. Wherever you place it is fine. I just found this as my best spot. Now, we have the tires off, like I said, and you can see. Now, this shock and the other shock are keeping this axle from completely relaxing, and also maybe some of the rear sway bar and the drive shaft. So what we're gonna do is we're going to lift up the jack a little bit, take off the shock, and then start to lower it and look for what's keeping the axle from coming all the way down. And we're also paying attention to make sure that nothing is getting stressed to the point of breakage, like your sway bar or your drive shaft or anything like that, because of your articulation and how the geometry of the axle is designed. You might not be able to just take the shocks off and then relax the whole axle and be able to take the springs out real easy, put the new ones in, blase blase. So don't just drop your axle, don't just drop everything and then be like, oh, okay, we're good. You might tear something up. So pay attention. You can see I got everything out. I was able to lower the axle and the spring came right out. I didn't have to disassemble anything. The suspension was maxed out, but I'm gonna have a spring compressor, so it's not gonna matter if I have the axle all the way dragged, you know, all the way drooping. So just know you're able to get the springs out and the shock out with this, but installing a lift, you're going to need to compress the spring or start to disassemble some other suspension components. But like I said, it's not necessary. And then also, if you see right here, my ABS system disconnected. So you need to make sure that you pay attention to stuff like that, because I didn't, and here we are. I'm probably gonna have the 3 Amigos, and now I'm gonna have to replace a ABS switch, or not switch, but sensor. So just like I said, pay attention to these things. Even though I told you guys to pay attention, I still messed up myself. So learn from my experience. And now that we're talking about this, let me make sure the other side didn't get messed up either. It did, it got unplugged also. So yeah, just pay attention, guys. Pay attention to your, you know, hoses and your cables and all that stuff, okay? So now I'm gonna compress my new spring, put it in there, and install the shock, and then put everything back together, and we'll see how it looks. So we got everything back up. I did have to disconnect the brake line, and because it was stretched. I mean, it was fine, but it was pretty stretched out, so I just wanted to be on the safe side and take that off. And like I said, I did mess this up, which I will do a repair video on that sometime in the near future. That will, if that stays like that, water will get in there and it'll fry everything, so we don't want that. But this is everything. Got the bottom and top bolt in and tight, but like I said earlier, I'm gonna put it to put the tires on and retighten all that, make sure it's all snug, because like I said, unsprung weight versus sprung weight, not unsprung versus unsprung weight, but sprung versus unsprung suspension is different. So I just want to make sure everything's good. And I will, since I did have to disconnect these brake lines, I will have to bleed brakes, but I'm not going to teach you guys that in this video. You guys can look that up on YouTube. But besides that, it's put the tires back on and set her down and get it all tightened back up, and we're good to go. And we'll see you guys here in a second. She's lifted, and if you could tell, all that gap, which I'm hoping that with all that extra gap now, 31-inch tire will fit, and I'll have a lot more of wheel travel and articulation and all that. And it'll also help with that geometry I was telling you about my approach angle, because now it's 2 inches higher. But all that being said, in a driveway by yourself, it's about a 6-hour job. Make sure you disconnect all the stuff that you think can get snagged or pulled or ripped. Make sure you guys tighten everything before and after putting the vehicle on the ground, and make sure that you guys drive it around and everything's settled and stuff before you guys take it out on the road, which I will be doing a third part to this, which is going to be the how I like it. You know, did it make the performance better? Do I have, you know, better off-roading capabilities? Now, granted, I still have the off-road tires, so I'm not going to do anything crazy, but I will try to do a video focused on the performance of the suspension. So all that being said, guys, thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys on the third video.